Hey, this is Harman Mixes and welcome to my audio training. This is a preview of a training that I give to churches on live stream mixing. So hopefully you enjoy this little preview, and if you're interested in having me out to do a live stream training for you, I would love to have you book me. Go to austinharmanmixes.com/book. Let's get into it. One of the most common reasons why churches go wrong with audio mixing with their live stream is that the people who are actually mixing the live stream are used to mixing a front of house sound. The reason why is because most of the people mixing the live stream are coming from front of house, and therefore they're trying to adopt the same principles and practice for front of house for the live stream. Now, this doesn't necessarily work because live stream mixing, broadcast mixing, requires a very different approach, and I'm going to break down why. First, let's start out with what we call the digital pipe. The digital pipe is a philosophical thing, that we can use to help us understand how live stream audio mixing differs from front of house audio mixing. Imagine, if you will, you have a water pipe, A water pipe can only accommodate so much water before the water starts to back up on one side or starts to kind of rush out and create a jet on the other, right? Whenever you have a really bad storm, the water starts to back up because the storm drainage system cannot accommodate all of the water. Now, in a digital domain, so when we're talking about live stream mixing, predominantly we're in the digital domain, which means that our audio is being represented by computing systems. Unlike an analog sound, where you have a kind of broader range of representative signals because you're in the electrical domain, in the digital domain, we have far less space to work with. And the reason for that is that if you take an audio signal, let's just imagine a waveform that goes like this, right? If you take that audio signal and try to represent that in the digital domain or in the computing domain, what you will have to do is you'll have to subdivide that signal into what we call samples. So just imagine slicing up that waveform into 100 different parts. Each sample kind of represents some place on that sound line, right? Now, each sample, because it is just a representation of a specific piece of that overall audio signal, therefore has a limit in how much pieces of that signal it can represent in both the length of audio signal as well as the depth of audio signal. If you want to sound really smart at the dinner table, the depth is what we call the bit rate, and the length is what we call the sample rate. Most audio computing systems run on a 48,000 hertz sample rate, or 44.1 sample rate, which means 44,100 times 48,000 times per second. That audio line is divided and represented in the computer. Most computing systems will also operate in either a 16-bit or 16 representative steps, or 32-bit or 32 representative steps, in order to represent the depth of that signal. Now, in the depth domain, we're representing what we call amplitude. That amplitude is how loud or how soft a signal can be. This is incredibly important when you are mixing a live stream audio, because your representation and how loud or how quiet something can be is certainly limited. Now, in a audio kind of front of house situation, you have a master fader, and if you turn it up to 11, your limit is how loud your speakers can get. And once they catch on fire, that's realistically your limit. Hopefully you don't do that, but that is truly your limit. Now, on the flip side of that, if you turn it down really quietly, the limit is theoretically the lowest sound that you can hear out of the stereo. In digital, however, your signal is not being represented in speakers or being heard at the quietest of volumes. It's being heard on TVs, it's being heard on headphones, it's being heard on phones. Very small, very tiny speakers have to represent these tiny sounds. And therefore, we have to approach our mixes very, very differently in order to make those sounds translate across as many different devices as possible. How we do this is we take advantage of the fact that our digital domain has a limited amount of amplitude, and we refer to this as the digital pipe, right? That amount of sound that can actually be represented in the digital domain, the digital pipe. We want to maximize that digital pipe to the best that we can without overflowing. Because when we overflow that digital pipe, we actually lose sound. That's what we call a clip. So if you imagine the pipe is like this, if we have sound that kind of juts out over that pipe, we lose it, i.e. a clip. And therefore that sounds like popping, that sounds like distortion. So we don't want that. Now, how do we take advantage of the digital pipe? Well, the first step is that we want to set proper gain structure. Now, I genuinely hate the term gain structure because as an audio engineer, I swear that's all anybody ever talks about. Gain structure this, gain structure that, gain structure this, gain structure that. And in reality, it's not always as simple as just saying set the gain and call it a day. You have to have an understanding as to what you're trying to do in order to set your gains properly, especially whenever it comes to broadcast mixing. Now, in broadcast, typically our gains are going to be shared with our front of house engineer. If you're not familiar with what a gain is, think about that subdivision process where we subdivide the audio coming into the desk into individual samples. We have to kind of set the amount of audio coming in the first place. That's done via a circuit called a preamp. That preamp is designed to take an electrical signal and then translate that into a louder electrical signal so that our circuitry inside the console can work with it. You have a preamp and then a audio analog to digital conversion, where we take that analog sound post preamp and then convert it into the digital space. That's where that sampling happens. Now, when we talk about gain structure, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to define how much amplification happens at that preamp stage. Now, in the preamp stage, we want to try and get an optimal amount of signal into the console so that when that subdivision process happens, it's happening in an optimal way. So that's part one of gain structure. Part two of gain structure is, and this is the part that most people don't understand whenever it comes to broadcast mixing, is that part two of the gain structure requires you to understand both the transient or peak of a sound and the average or RMS of the sound. Now, if you imagine going back to our waveform example again, on the top side of that wave, we actually have what's called an attack, then there's a sustain, and then there's a release. Now, the attack of a note is typically a very fast, very loud attack aspect of the sound. And then we have a sustain, which is a much more longer, much more controlled aspect of the sound. And then we have the release, which is kind of the tail. The attack sucks up quite a bit of our digital domain, right? Because we have to represent a very large sound, but then the sustain is kind of this moderate sound that happens after the fact. Now, what happens in so many situations when we're mixing broadcast is you'll get complaints that the broadcast mix is just not loud enough. Why? Well, the problem is that most of your audio mixing is happening with those attacks. And that is setting the floor and the ceiling of how loud your system or sound is because you're mixing around those attacks. Gain structure in the broadcast environment, in the live stream environment, in this digital domain requires you also to deal with the attacks and to deal with your RMS or the average sound, the sustained sound, so that you can kind of shove as much as possible into that digital pipe. Now, how do we actually do that? Well, very simple. We're going to work with some magic called compression. Now, compression is a very fantastic thing that we have at our disposal as audio engineers. Endlessly debated as far as whether you should use it or not. It is somewhat of a requirement if you're going to get a great live stream sound because you're required to control that dynamic range. In fact, if you're coming from a live environment and going to a broadcast environment, live stream environment, you're gonna find that it's almost uncomfortable the amount of compression that is required in order to get a great broadcast sound. Now here's a fundamental philosophy you'll want to remember while you're mixing broadcast. The tighter the mix, the better it's going to translate across many different sources. That's a key point. The tighter your mix, the less dynamic range the mix has, the fuller your digital pipe is, the better it's going to translate across many different domains. It is ultra important to understand what I'm talking about there, because if you do not follow this philosophy whenever it comes to broadcast mixing, your mixes may sound great on your headphones, but they're going to sound terrible on your TV. They're going to sound terrible in the car, but they're going to sound cool on the studio monitors. You have to understand that the tighter your mix is, the better off you're going to be in broadcast. Now, how we actually achieve that is somewhat of a complicated multi-step process. Step number one with that process is we have to look at what are the most aggressive sources that are coming in from the stage. Now, most of the time, let's say in modern worship music, you're going to have drums. Those are going to have the most aggressive attacks out of all of your sources. Now, next will probably be vocals, because you're going to get a lot of transients in those vocal mics, which are more or less cymbal microphones if they're on stage and you have a live drum set. Now, those of you who don't have a live drum set, you have an electric drum set, this is a little bit lesser of an issue for you, but it is still certainly something to pay attention to. Once you've identified those sources that are the most problematic, step number two is actually dealing with them. And how we deal with them will require us to actually go to the audio console, and I'm going to give you a quick demo of live drums and how we actually deal with those drums in a broadcast situation. Let's go.